Hi, and welcome to week 5, where we turn our attention to interpreting Old Testament poetry and exploring parallelism. While poetic texts may be found throughout the Old Testament, the bulk of the poetic literature can be found in Psalms, Song of Solomon, Proverbs, Job, and the prophetic books. The focus of this lecture is on the poetry found in Psalms. The prophetic books will be treated as a separate category in a later lecture. In the Old Testament, poetry and narrative exist on a continuum. While it is certainly possible for the readers to identify these genres as distinct in most instances, there are passages such as Genesis 1, Psalm 78, and Psalm 106, which contain a number of characteristics that are common to both narrative and poetry. In general, poetry relies heavily on parallelism, or the pairing of lines. Poetry is often terse in that they do not elaborate in the same way narrative does. Statements are generally short, to the point, and often exhibit the use of ellipsis, or the tendency to drop a major element out of the second poetic line. Poetry also utilizes metaphor more frequently than narrative. When examining poetry, it is extremely important to pay attention to parallel lines. Lines often define or develop each other by comparison or contrast. It is also important to understand what sort of poetry you are reading. There are a number of designations, and scholars often debate about the form of particular poems. It is important to recognize these general categories because they ultimately determine how much of the language that is used in a particular psalm. For instance, the first words of Psalm 74, "O God, why have you rejected us perpetually while your anger burns against the sheep of your pasture?" This statement seems harsh, but because it is part of a lament psalm, this language must be understood in a particular way. Poetry often uses exaggerated language in both lament and praise or thanksgiving psalms. At the same time, particularly in the Psalms, connections between poems should be noted. The Psalms were collected and arranged into theologically significant sections so that the entire book, not just the individual Psalms, provides a message to the reader. In general, the Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and the prophetic books are regarded as poetry, though there is a wide range of forms and subgenres within these books. Proverbs, for instance, while technically classed as Hebrew poetry, are really a specific sort of Hebrew poetry that must be treated from a slightly different vantage point. It may be helpful to think of wisdom literature and prophecy as specialized genres of Old Testament poetry, which exhibit many of the general characteristics of poetry alongside unique elements that make these genres distinct. In this example, the focus will be on paired lines, but it is important to keep in mind that parallelism is found not only in couplets, 2 lines, but also in triplets and quatrains, 3 or 4 lines, and sometimes in whole stanzas. There are 6 general types of parallelism exhibited in Old Testament poetry: synonymous parallelism, synthetic parallelism, antithetic parallelism, emblematic parallelism, climactic parallelism, and formal parallelism. The descriptions of these parallelisms were adapted by William Van Gemeren's introduction into the expository Bible commentary, and we'll spend a few minutes now unpacking each of these types. Synonymous parallelism refers to a sort of parallelism in which the second of the two parallel lines reinforces the thought of the first parallel line by using similar words and concepts. As an example, Job 38 verse 7 provides a good example. While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Note the parallel between sang and shouted, as well as that between together in line 1 and all in line 2. In this instance, stars and angels are also most likely parallel, with stars being used as an alternative term for angels. Other examples of synonymous parallelism can be found in Psalm 3, Psalm 25, Psalm 49, Proverbs 11, and Proverbs 12. Synthetic parallelism refers to a sort of parallelism in which the second line adds to or completes the idea of the first line. Psalm 95 verse 3 utilizes synthetic parallelism when it writes, "For Yahweh is a great God and a great King above all gods." In this verse, Yahweh is first pictured as a great God. This assertion is expanded in the second line to include the idea of kingship over all other gods. Antithetic parallelism refers to a sort of parallelism in which the thought of the first line is contrasted in the second line. Proverbs 10:1 utilizes antithetic parallelism when it writes, "A wise son causes his father to rejoice, but a foolish son is a grief to his father," or to his mother. This type of parallelism is often marked by a contrastive conjunction such as but or yet, as well as containing other forms of wise and foolish language. Emblematic parallelism refers to a sort of parallelism in which the first line uses a figure of speech to illuminate the main point conveyed in the second line. Psalm 42:1 reads, "As the deer craves streams of water, so my soul longs for you, O God." In this verse, the use of "as" signals a simile in verse 1. The figurative language of the verse is obvious. The comparison between the soul's longing for God and the deer's desire for water gives a sense of desperation and necessity. The psalmist, like the deer without water, will not survive apart from God. Climactic parallelism is a sort of parallelism in which the second line repeats the first, with the exception of the last term. A good example of this sort of parallelism may be found in Psalm 29 verse 1, "Ascribe to Yahweh, O sons of the Mighty One. Ascribe to Yahweh glory and strength." Here, the exact repetition of "ascribe to Yahweh" in both lines and then the addition of glory and strength suggests climactic parallelism. Formal parallelism is a sort of parallelism in which the lines are joined solely by metric considerations. This sort of parallelism is often difficult to identify in English translations. An example can be found in Psalm 2, verse 6. However, it is difficult without understanding Hebrew to be able to go into specifics, and your assignment won't cover formal parallelism. Hebrew poetry utilizes a wide array of figurative language. Simile and metaphor, as well as hyperbole, anthropomorphisms, personifications, and synecdoche are often found in Hebrew poetry. Psalm 23 begins with a metaphor, "The Lord is my shepherd." It may also be possible to identify an instance of personification in verse 6 when goodness and loving kindness pursue the psalmist. Scholars have identified poetic forms. The forms noted on the screen that you're seeing now are helpful in so much as they provide broad categories into which a wide variety of psalms may be placed. These forms are flexible and contain psalms may be difficult to place, and certain psalms may be difficult to place into a particular category. Use these categories as a starting point to help you understand what is happening in a given psalm, but be sure to account for the distinctive elements within any given psalm, as well as noting the way in which these distinctive elements are conditioned by the psalm's literary context. In a royal psalm, the emphasis on the psalm concerns God's kingship. Often these psalms point into the future, toward that time in which God's rule will be made manifest. God may be referred to as the Savior of Israel or the Creator. In a Zion psalm, Jerusalem, referred to by the name Zion, is made the center of attention. According to Allenberger, Zion is used as a symbol representing Jerusalem as the city of the great king. These psalms often focus on Zion as the locale where God chose for the site of his temple and the worship of his name. In a penitential psalm, the poet writing these psalms confesses sin to God. After asking and receiving God's forgiveness, he breaks out in praise of God. Wisdom psalms emphasize the distinction between the righteous and the wicked. They often contain a description of or call to righteous living, as well as content related to the God's blessing or curse. Often, the Torah is a topic within these psalms. Creation and history of Israel are also topics addressed in wisdom songs. In imprecatory psalms, they contain a call for God to curse the psalmist's enemies or the wicked. Though these requests may seem different or difficult for us to reconcile with the loving God and the call to forgive those who wrong us, it is important to remember that justice is also a central concern of the gospel. In these psalms, the psalmist cries out to God to act against the injustice and to protect the righteous. Praise psalms focus exclusively on the praise of God. The psalms of trust express a deep confidence in God and God's goodness. Trust psalms are not cries of victory, but are an expression of the means through which victory will come. These psalms may contain several non-essential elements, such as an invitation to trust, a statement concerning the basis of the psalmist's trust, a petition or a vow or promise to the Lord. Trust psalms do not include an explicit lament. Lament psalms express the deep emotions of the psalmist in the midst of suffering. They are honest, challenging words of transparency for those in pain. The structure of a lament includes, first, an introductory cry to God. Second, the lament. Third, a confession of trust. Fourth, a rationale of God's action. And finally, petitions and vows. Well, now that you better understand the types of parallelism and forms of biblical poetry, the next lecture will walk you through an analysis of Psalm 23. Thanks for your attention, and have a blessed day.